During dinner, I overheard my daughter-in-law say, "That old witch lives here for free and still thinks she deserves respect." I kept eating. 2 days later, my lawyer paid her a visit to inform her I had stopped paying the mortgage of the house she lived in. The meatloaf suddenly felt like sawdust in my mouth. My hands trembled slightly as I carefully set down my fork, pretending I hadn't heard Diane's words floating from the kitchen. She was speaking to her sister on the phone, not bothering to lower her voice. Why would she? In her mind, I was just a deaf old woman who had overstayed her welcome. 50 years of teaching elementary school had taught me when to speak up and when silence was the more powerful choice. This was definitely a moment for silence. I took a sip of water, willing my racing heart to slow down. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. Richard, my son, was working late again at the accounting firm. He wasn't here to witness this moment, another in a long string of small humiliations I'd endured since moving in 3 years ago. "I know," Diane continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "She acts like she's doing us a favor by being here, as if we wouldn't be better off without her hovering around all the time." I carefully cut another piece of meatloaf, mechanically bringing it to my lips. My 72-year-old joints ached, but not nearly as much as my heart. This house, the beautiful 2-story colonial with the wraparound porch that Richard and Diane had achieved through hard work, was actually my final gift to them. A gift they knew nothing about. When I moved in after Harold died, they had graciously offered me the guest room, until I got back on my feet. 3 years later, that temporary arrangement had calcified into resentment, at least on Diane's part. What she didn't know was that every month, quietly and without fanfare, I transferred $2,400 to cover their mortgage payment. The arrangement had been set up through my attorney, Wilson Abernathy, who had been Harold's best friend and my trusted advisor for decades. "Mom, are you okay?" Diane's voice shifted to sugary sweetness as she entered the dining room, noticing my half-eaten dinner. "Just a bit tired, dear," I replied, mustering a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "The meatloaf is delicious." "Well, don't force yourself," she said, already turning away. "I'll clean up later." That night, I lay awake in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The guest room had never been redecorated to feel like my space. My cherished belongings, the antique rocking chair Harold had restored for our 20th anniversary, my collection of first edition novels, the handmade quilt my mother had created, were all in storage. "Just until we figure out how to incorporate them," Diane had said 3 years ago. Somehow that moment never arrived. I thought about the decades of sacrifices that had led to this moment. After Harold died unexpectedly of a heart attack, leaving me a widow at 69, I'd sold our beloved farmhouse, the one we'd spent 40 years turning into a home. The housing market had been good, and the sale brought in enough to pay off the remaining mortgage and leave a substantial sum. Richard and Diane had been struggling with their adjustable rate mortgage, their payments ballooning beyond what they could comfortably afford. Without telling them, I'd arranged through Wilson to pay off their existing loan and establish a new fixed-rate mortgage, with me as the actual payer, though their names remained on all the paperwork. "Are you sure about this arrangement, Martha?" Wilson had asked, concern evident in his kind eyes. "They should know what you're doing for them." "No," I'd insisted. "Richard has too much pride. He wouldn't accept it if he knew. This way, they can feel successful, and I can help without anyone feeling indebted." What noble foolishness that had been. The next morning, I called Wilson's office before Richard and Diane were awake. "Wilson, it's Martha," I said quietly, sitting in the small alcove by the back door where I took my morning coffee. "I need to see you today, it's important." 3 hours later, I sat in the familiar leather chair across from Wilson's desk, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to stop their trembling. "Martha, you don't look well," he said, genuine concern in his voice. Unlike most people in my life, Wilson still saw me, the real me, not just an elderly obligation. "I'm done, Wilson," I said simply. My voice sounded stronger than I felt. "I heard Diane yesterday. She called me that old witch who lives there for free. After everything I've done." Wilson's expression darkened. "I warned you about this arrangement." "Yes, you did," I acknowledged. "And you were right. But that's water under the bridge now. I want to stop the payments immediately." "Martha, are you certain? This is a significant decision." I nodded, a strange sense of calm settling over me. "I've given enough. Too much, perhaps." I want to use what's left of my savings to find my own place, something small but mine. And I want them to know the truth. Wilson leaned back, studying me. They won't take this well. No, I agreed. They won't. But I'm 72 years old, Wilson. How much longer should I silently endure being treated like an unwanted houseguest in a home that I'm actually paying for? He nodded slowly. What exactly do you want me to do? Stop the payment scheduled for next week. Then I want you to come to the house with all the documentation and explain the situation to both of them. My heart raced at the thought, but, I continued, I'll look for an apartment this week. I don't want to be there for the fallout. You've thought this through, Wilson observed. I've had 3 years of being invisible to think about it, I replied. 2 days later, as I quietly packed a small suitcase with essentials, I heard the doorbell ring. Right on time. Wilson was always punctual. I took a deep breath and made my way downstairs. Richard had come home early at my request. He and Diane were sitting in the living room, confusion evident on their faces as Wilson introduced himself. Mom, what's going on? Richard asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I met his gaze steadily. Something you both need to hear. Wilson cleared his throat, opening his briefcase. I'm here on Martha's behalf to inform you of some financial matters that affect this household. The look of confusion on Diane's face was about to transform into something else entirely. After decades of silence, the truth was finally going to speak for itself. 3 years ago, when Harold died, I made a decision that changed everything. As we laid him to rest, Richard whispered, Don't worry, Mom. We'll figure things out. He didn't know Harold had already figured things out. The life insurance was substantial. Our house was paid off, and I had savings to last my remaining years. A month later, I sat in Wilson's office. I want to help Richard and Diane with their mortgage, I said. They're struggling more than they admit. Wilson frowned. Martha, they're adults. Let them manage their finances. Richard took a pay cut when his company downsized, I explained. And Diane's design business is failing. I want to do this without them knowing, I continued. Richard is too proud, like his father. Wilson's expression softened. He and Harold had been friends since college. Are you sure? They should know what you're doing. No, this way they can feel successful. They've offered me their guest room until I get back on my feet. I'll stay there while covering their mortgage. Where will you live afterward? Wilson asked. I looked away. There was no afterward in my plan. Martha, Wilson said gently, I think you're making a mistake. Secrets cause harm. I smiled sadly. Maybe, but I've spent my life taking care of others. This is my choice. 3 years passed. The guest room became my room, though it never felt like mine. My belongings remained in storage, my preferences ignored, my presence merely tolerated. Now, as Wilson laid out the documents, I watched the truth hit them like a physical blow. Martha has been making the mortgage payments for 3 years, Wilson explained. The total is $86,400. Richard's face went ashen. Mom, is this true? I nodded. Yes. But why wouldn't you tell us? He asked, bewildered. Before I could answer, Diane cut in sharply. This is ridiculous. We never asked for this. Wilson gave her a cool look. Mrs. Wells, perhaps you'd like to review the payment history. Richard picked up a document, hands trembling. I don't understand. We've been making payments every month. To an escrow account, Wilson explained. Martha established it when she sold her home. Your mortgage was refinanced and she's been making the actual payments. Diane's face hardened. So what are you saying? That we owe her this money? I'm not asking for repayment, I said quietly. I'm simply telling you the truth and letting you know that the payment due next week will not be made. Richard looked stricken. Mom, why now? Did something happen? I hesitated, unwilling to repeat Diane's cruel words. But I was tired of protecting everyone's feelings except my own. I overheard Diane 2 days ago, I said finally. She called me that old witch who lives here for free and still thinks she deserves respect. Richard's face crumpled. Mom, I'm so sorry. She doesn't mean, please don't make excuses, I interrupted gently. I've felt unwelcome for a long time. So what do you want? Diane demanded, arms crossed defensively. I'm moving out, I said, the words both terrifying and liberating. I've found an apartment in a senior community. The lie came easily. I hadn't found a place yet. but I would. The important thing was making a clean break. You can't just leave, Richard protested, though Diane remained silent. This is your home too. I shook my head. No, Richard. No, Richard. It never has been. Wilson cleared his throat. There's one more thing. The payments Richard and Diane have been making to the escrow account have been deposited into a separate savings account in Martha's name. Diane's eyes widened. You mean we've been essentially paying rent to her? Not rent, Wilson corrected. Martha wanted you to feel you were contributing. I reached for Richard's hand. I'll use that money to start my new life. Now it's time for me to create a space of my own. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Mom, I had no idea. I know, I said gently. That was my choice. Diane stood abruptly. I need some air. She stalked out, the door slamming behind her. That night, as I packed, I heard Richard and Diane arguing downstairs. Their voices carried fragments. Disrespectful. Never told me. Your mother. Our house. I sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted. For years, I had lived a life of quiet sacrifice. Now I wondered if I had sacrificed too much. Not just my home and money, but my dignity. Tomorrow, I would start looking for an apartment, something small but bright, with space for my books. A place where I could finally stop shrinking myself to accommodate others. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I was looking forward to tomorrow. Whatever came next would be my choice. That thought alone was worth every penny I'd spent on a house that had never truly been my home. Finding an apartment at 72 isn't easy, especially when you haven't had a place of your own in years. The morning after Wilson's visit, I sat in a small cafe downtown, laptop open, searching for senior living options. After 3 years of living in Richard and Diane's house, feeling like a ghost, I was both terrified and exhilarated by the prospect of independence. More coffee, ma'am? A young waitress smiled at me. Please, I replied. And I'm Martha. I'm Jenny. She refilled my cup. Looking for a place? She nodded toward my screen. Yes, starting over at my age. Jenny's smile softened. My grandmother did that at 75 after my grandfather passed. Said it was the most freeing thing she ever did. How did it work out for her? I asked. She's 83 now, has more friends than I do, and is dating a retired professor. Her only regret is not doing it sooner. After she left, I looked at the listings with new determination. My phone rang. Wilson. I've been thinking about your situation, he said. My sister-in-law manages Riverside Gardens. It's a small apartment complex for seniors, nothing fancy but well-maintained. They have a 1-bedroom opening next week. My heart quickened. Riverside Gardens? With the community garden and book club? The very same, Wilson confirmed. Interested? Very, I breathed. I'd driven past it many times, admiring its neat brick buildings and flowering courtyards. I'll set up a viewing for tomorrow. After we hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. But as I drove back to Richard and Diane's house, dread settled over me again. The past day had been relatively quiet. Richard had left for work early, avoiding conversation. Diane had barely acknowledged my presence at breakfast. I noticed Richard's car in the driveway when I arrived home. He rarely came home for lunch. Something was wrong. Inside, I found him at the kitchen table staring at his laptop. His face was pale, his tie loosened. Richard? What's happened? He looked up, his expression pained. The bank called. They're concerned about the missed mortgage payment. But it's not due for another week, I frowned. There's a problem with the transition, and Diane's business is struggling. We don't have the full amount ready. How much are you short? I asked. About half, he admitted. I can get an advance on my paycheck, but not until next Friday. I reached for my purse. I can help with this month. No, his voice was firm. You've helped enough, Mom. I studied. My son, the worry lines that hadn't been there when he was younger, the flecks of gray at his temples. When had he grown so old? It's just a loan, I said gently. Richard shook his head. Diane and I need to figure this out ourselves. I nodded, respecting his decision. What about the money in the escrow account? That's your money now, he said firmly, for your new place. Our conversation was interrupted by Diane walking in, arms full of shopping bags from expensive boutiques. She froze briefly when she saw us. You're home early, she said to Richard. Is everything okay? Richard's expression tightened as he looked at the bags. We need to talk about our finances. I stood up. I should give you privacy. No, stay, Richard said, surprising both Diane and me. Mom should hear this too. Diane reluctantly sat down. What's going on? The bank called about the mortgage, Richard explained. There's an issue with the transition, and we don't have enough for the full payment. Diane's eyes darted to the shopping bags, then away. I'm sure we can figure something out. Maybe borrow from your 401k? That would take too long, Richard said. And there are penalties. He gestured to the bags. What's all this, Diane? We just talked about cutting back. She stiffened. It's nothing. Just a few things I needed. We need to pay our mortgage, Richard said, his voice rising slightly. I watched them, noticing how Diane shifted blame, minimized her spending while maximizing her righteousness, a pattern I'd seen for years but never fully acknowledged. Maybe I should help with this month's payment, I suggested again. Diane's eyes lit up, but Richard shook his head. No, Mom, we're not going to keep depending on you. I felt a complicated mix of pride in my son's determination and concern for their situation, but another part of me felt relieved. For once, I wasn't responsible for fixing everyone else's problems. I have an appointment to see an apartment tomorrow, I said, changing the subject, at Riverside Gardens. Richard looked up. Really? That's a nice place. It's just a viewing, I cautioned. Wilson's sister-in-law manages the property. Riverside Gardens is expensive, Diane commented, calculating. Are you sure you can afford it? I met her gaze steadily. Yes, the escrow. Account funds will cover the deposit and several months' rent. Diane's lips thinned, but she said nothing more. That night, as I lay in bed listening to Richard and Diane argue in hushed voices downstairs, I made a decision. I would help them with this month's mortgage payment. Not out of obligation, but as a parting gift, a clean break for all of us. But first, I needed to secure my own future. The next morning, Wilson picked me up at 9. Riverside Gardens was even lovelier up close. Neat brick buildings surrounding flowering courtyards, with benches in shady spots. Residents were chatting, reading, or tending small garden plots. Each apartment comes with a patio or balcony, explained Lisa, Wilson's sister-in-law, and residents can have a garden plot if they want. I used to love gardening, I said. Before I moved in with Richard and Diane, the apartment was smaller than I was used to, but bright and clean with large windows overlooking a courtyard. The previous tenant had recently moved to assisted living, and they were repainting and installing new carpeting. When would it be available? I asked. 2 weeks, Lisa said. We need to finish the renovations. 2 more weeks in Richard and Diane's house. Knowing this was waiting for me, I could manage that. What do you think? Wilson asked when Lisa stepped out to take a phone call. It's perfect, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. When Lisa returned, I told her my decision. She seemed pleased, explaining that she'd need a deposit to hold the apartment, along with some paperwork. I can write a check. Right now, I said. An hour later, it was done. I had signed the lease, written the deposit check, and officially secured my new home. As Wilson drove me back, I felt lighter than I had in years. You seem happy, Wilson observed. I am, I realized. For the first time in a long time, I'm doing something for myself. Harold would be proud, Wilson said quietly. He always worried about you putting everyone else first. As we pulled into Richard and Diane's driveway, I felt curiously detached. This wasn't my home. It never had been. But soon, I would have a place of my own. A place where I could finally exist fully as myself. I opened the front door, already composing what I would say to Richard about the mortgage payment. But the scene that greeted me stopped me cold. Richard and Diane were in the living room with a tall, elegant woman I'd never seen before. They fell silent as I entered. Mom, Richard said, his voice strained. This is Elaine Mercer. She's a real estate agent. We were just discussing options. The implication was clear. They were considering selling the house I had sacrificed everything to help them keep. The silence in the living room was deafening. I stood frozen in the doorway, purse clutched in my hand, as I processed what was happening. A real estate agent. They were planning to sell the house I had paid for. Mrs. Wells, the agent stepped forward, hand extended. Elaine Mercer, your son speaks very highly of you. I shook her hand automatically, social conditioning taking over despite my shock. Richard cleared his throat. Mom, we were just exploring some options, with the mortgage situation. I see, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. When were you planning to tell me? Diane's chin lifted with familiar defiance. We're just gathering information. There's nothing to tell yet. Elaine glanced between us, sensing the tension. Perhaps I should come back another time, when you've had a chance to discuss things as a family. That would be best. That would be best. Richard agreed quickly. After escorting Elaine out, Richard returned, shoulders hunched defensively. Mom, it's not what you think. What is it then? I asked quietly. We can't afford the mortgage, he admitted, sinking onto the couch. Not without your help. We've been living beyond our means for years. Diane crossed her arms. Downsizing is the responsible choice. I felt oddly conflicted, hurt that they would consider selling the house I'd sacrificed so much for, yet relieved. They were finally facing reality. I secured an apartment today, I told them. At Riverside Gardens. I move in 2 weeks. That was fast, Diane remarked, something calculating in her eyes. Wilson helped, I explained. His sister-in-law is the property manager. Richard looked concerned. Are you sure about this, Mom? It's all happening so quickly. I'm sure, I said firmly. It's time. Diane paced the room, agitated. What about the escrow account money? If you're not using it all for your apartment, and there it was, the real reason for her interest, not concern for me, but for what I could provide. The money is mine, I said quietly but firmly, to use as I see fit. But if you're already set with this apartment, surely you don't need all of it, she pressed. We're family, after all. Richard shot her a warning look. Diane, stop. No, let her continue, I said, suddenly calm. I want to hear what she has to say, Diane composed herself. All I'm saying is that we're in a difficult position, a position we wouldn't be in if we'd known about the mortgage arrangement from the beginning. Are you blaming me? I asked incredulously. For paying your mortgage for 3 years? Of course not, she backpedaled. We could have planned better if we'd known. I looked at my daughter-in-law, really looked at her, and saw her clearly. The entitlement, the manipulation, the complete lack of gratitude. I was going to offer to help with this month's mortgage payment, I said slowly, as a parting gift. But now I see that would be a mistake. Richard's face fell. Mom, Diane doesn't speak for both of us. I appreciate everything you've done. Do you? I asked. Because it seems like you both just want what you can get from me. That's not fair, Richard protested, but his eyes couldn't meet mine. Isn't it? I gestured around. I gave up my home, so you could keep yours. I've lived as a guest in a house I was paying for. And now that I'm taking control of my life, your first thought is to sell the house and ask for more money. Diane flushed. You're twisting everything. We're just being practical. So am I replied. I won't be helping with the mortgage. Not this month. Not ever again. Richard stood, pained. Mom, please don't let things end like this. This isn't an ending, Richard. It's a beginning. For all of us. I walked upstairs, suddenly exhausted. I'm going to continue packing. You two have decisions to make about your future, without my financial involvement. As I climbed the stairs, I heard Diane hiss, This is your fault. You shouldn't have let Elaine come here today. My fault? Richard's voice rose. You're the one spending money we don't have. Their argument faded as I closed my bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling slightly. They had been planning to sell the house, probably hoping to convince me to loan them money for a new place. The old Martha would have given in. The old Martha would have sacrificed again. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I called Wilson and told him what happened. I'm not surprised, he said. Without your support, they probably can't afford the house. Diane had the nerve to ask about the escrow money, I continued. She still sees me as nothing but an ATM. What did you tell her? That the money is mine to use as I see fit, and that I won't help with the mortgage. Not even this month. Good. For you, Wilson approved. It's about time you put yourself first. After hanging up, I continued packing, separating my meager possessions from the life I'd been living. It was surprising how little I actually owned after 3 years. Clothes, a few books, some photographs, Harold's watch. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Richard stood in the doorway looking contrite. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I nodded, setting down the sweater I'd been folding. He sat beside me, looking at his hands. Selling the house wasn't my idea. Diane's been pushing for it since we found out about the mortgage. It doesn't matter whose idea it was, I said gently. You're adults making your own decisions. I feel like I've failed, he admitted, his voice breaking. Dad would be so disappointed. I placed my hand over his. No, Richard. Your father would understand that life takes unexpected turns. I should have known, he said. All these years, you've been helping us, and I never questioned how we were managing. That's on me, I said. I chose not to tell you. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. Why, Mom? Why did you sacrifice so much for us? I considered carefully. Because that's what I thought love meant. Giving until there was nothing left. I was wrong. I don't want to lose you, he said. You won't, I promised. But our relationship needs to change. No more financial dependence. No more secrets. Richard nodded slowly. I'm going to make this right somehow. I smiled genuinely. Start by figuring out what you and Diane really want. Not just with the house, but with your lives. After he left, I continued packing with renewed purpose. In 2 weeks, I would start my new life at Riverside Gardens. I would join the book club, plant flowers in the garden, make new friends. I would exist fully as Martha Wells, not just as Richard's mother or Diane's unwanted mother-in-law. For the first time in years, I felt truly hopeful. Not because I had all the answers, but because I had finally asked the right questions. Who am I when I'm not taking care of everyone else? What do I want for the remaining chapters of my life? How do I learn to put myself first without feeling guilty? As I drifted off to sleep, I realized I was looking forward to discovering the answers. On my own terms, in my own space, living my own life. The house I had sacrificed so much for was never meant to be my home. My real home was waiting for me. At Riverside Gardens. And beyond that, in the person I was finally allowing myself to become. The next week passed in a blur of preparations. I sorted through my possessions, deciding what to keep and what to discard. Each item represented a choice about the life I wanted to create. Harold's blue cardigan, keep. The formal dining set I'd been storing for Richard and Diane, let them have it. My gardening books, definitely keep. Wilson helped me retrieve items from my storage unit on Saturday. Walking into the small space felt like stepping into a time capsule. My reading chair, collection of hand-painted teacups, and the quilt my mother had made, carefully wrapped in acid-free paper. You kept more than I thought, Wilson observed. I couldn't bear to part with everything, I admitted, even when I thought I'd never have my own place again. By mid-afternoon, we had filled Wilson's car with the first load of my treasures to be stored at his house until my move-in date. When I returned to Richard and Diane's house that evening, the atmosphere had changed. Richard greeted me with a strained smile. Diane was nowhere to be seen, and dinner was takeout pizza on paper plates, a far cry from the home-cooked meals I usually prepared. How was your day? Richard asked. Productive, I said. Wilson helped me go through my storage unit. Richard nodded, his expression complicated. Mom, about the house. I held up a hand. You don't owe me explanations, Richard. It's your house now. But it wouldn't be our house at all if not for you, he insisted. Chapter 5. Painful Revelations. The next week passed in a blur of preparations. I sorted through my possessions, deciding what to keep and what to discard. Each item represented a choice about the life I wanted to create. Harold's blue cardigan, keep. The formal dining set I'd been storing for Richard and Diane, let them have it. My gardening books, definitely keep. Wilson helped me retrieve items from my storage unit on Saturday. Walking into the small space felt like stepping into a time capsule. My reading chair, collection of hand-painted teacups, and the quilt my mother had made, carefully wrapped in acid-free paper. You kept more than I thought, Wilson observed, as we sorted through boxes. I couldn't bear to part with everything, I admitted, even when I thought I'd never have my own place again. By mid-afternoon, we had filled Wilson's car with the first load of my treasures to be stored temporarily at his house until my move-in date. When I returned to Richard and Diane's house that evening, the atmosphere had changed. Richard greeted me with a strained smile. Diane was nowhere to be seen, and dinner was takeout pizza on paper plates, a far cry from the home-cooked meals I usually prepared. How was your day? Richard asked, setting a slice on my plate. Productive, I said. Wilson helped me go through my storage unit. Richard nodded, his expression complicated. Mom, about the house. I held up a hand. You don't owe me explanations, Richard. It's your house now, your decision. But it wouldn't be our house at all if not for you, he insisted. And after what you've done, it feels wrong to just sell it. Life changes, I said simply. We adapt. We ate in silence for a few minutes before Richard spoke again, his voice hesitant. Diane's sister called today. She's getting divorced, needs a place to stay. Diane offered her our guest room, your room, after you leave. I absorbed this information, wondering if that had been the plan all along, to replace me with someone Diane actually wanted around. I see, I said carefully. When does she arrive? Richard looked uncomfortable. That's the thing. She needs to move in next weekend. I told Diane it was too soon, that you might not be ready, but Diane insisted. I finished for him. And you gave in, as usual. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Richard flinched as if I'd slapped him. I'm sorry, I said quickly. That wasn't fair. No, you're right, he said quietly. I've always taken the path of least resistance with Diane. It was easier than fighting. We lapsed into silence again. I thought about Diane's sister coming to stay, another person needing help, another reason for Richard to drain his resources. Would the pattern ever end? I need to ask you something, Richard said abruptly, and I want the absolute truth. I nodded, curious. Have you been happy here? Ever? The question caught me off guard. I considered deflecting, offering a polite half-truth to spare his feelings. But hadn't there been enough secrets between us? No, I said softly. Not really, Richard exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath. I was afraid of that. It's not. Your fault, I added quickly. You tried to make me feel welcome. Not hard enough, he said bitterly. I let Diane set the tone, and she made it clear from day one that you were temporary, an obligation. I couldn't deny it. Why did you let her treat me that way? Richard's shoulders slumped. Because I'm weak. Because I was afraid of losing her. If I pushed back. Because it was easier to hope things would improve on their own. His honesty was both painful and refreshing. For the first time, we were having a real conversation, not just the polite exchanges we'd maintained for years. Your father was the same way at first, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Richard looked up, startled. Dad, but he always seemed so confident, so in control. I smiled sadly. That came later. When we were first married, he let his mother run right over both of us. I was the woman who stole her son, never good enough, never welcome in her home. I never knew that, Richard said. Harold didn't stand up to her until I was pregnant. With you, I continued. She made some comment about how I wasn't fit to raise a child, and something in him just snapped. He told her if she couldn't respect his wife, she wouldn't be part of our lives. What happened? Richard asked. She didn't speak to us for 6 months. Then she showed up at the hospital when you were born, apologized to me, sincerely, and things were better after that. Not perfect, but better. Richard absorbed this story, his expression thoughtful. I always thought you and Dad had the perfect marriage. No marriage is perfect, I said gently, but we learned to stand up for each other. That made all the difference. A key turned in the front door, and Diane walked in, shopping bags in hand. She paused when she saw us sitting together, something wary in her expression. Am I interrupting? She asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really care. Not at all, I said, rising to clear my plate. I was just heading upstairs to continue packing. Richard caught my hand before I could leave. Thank you, Mom, for telling me about Dad. I squeezed his hand in response, then headed upstairs, leaving Richard to deal with Diane. As I climbed the stairs, I heard Diane's voice, sharp and accusatory. What were you two talking about for so long? I didn't wait to hear Richard's response. I had my own concerns to focus on. The next morning, I was surprised to find Richard alone in the kitchen making coffee. Usually he was gone before I came downstairs. No work today? I asked, reaching for a mug. I called in, he said, pouring coffee for both of us. I need to talk to you, and I didn't want to wait. We settled at the kitchen table, morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Richard looked tired, as if he hadn't slept well. Diane and I had a long conversation last night, he began. About a lot of things. The house, our finances, our marriage. He took a deep breath. I told her I wasn't comfortable with her sister moving in so quickly, that we needed to respect your timeline. I blinked, surprised. How did she take that? Not well, Richard admitted with a grimace. She accused me of choosing you over her, said if I'd been this assertive about our finances years ago, we wouldn't be in this mess. She's not entirely wrong, I pointed out gently. No, she's not, Richard agreed. But the way she said it, it was mean, Mom, like she wanted to hurt me. He stared into his coffee. She's been like that a lot lately, or maybe always, and I just didn't want to see it. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to agree, to validate what he was finally seeing for himself. But another part The mother who wanted to protect him from pain hesitated. Relationships go through rough patches, I said carefully. Especially when there's financial stress. Richard looked up, his expression serious. It's more than that. When I think about how she's treated you all these years, the little comments, the way she excluded you from family decisions. He shook his head. I'm ashamed of myself for allowing it. You were caught in the middle, I said. That's never an easy place to be. But I should have stood up for you, he insisted. Like Dad eventually stood up for you with Grandma. I reached across the table and took his hand. We all make mistakes, Richard. The important thing is that we learn from them. He nodded, then took a deep breath. There's something else you should know. About the house. My stomach tightened. What about it? Richard hesitated, then spoke quietly. Diane wants to use the proceeds from the sale to buy a condo at Lakeside Terrace. I knew the place. A luxury development with a golf course and spa. Far beyond what they could afford, even with the sale of the house. I see, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I told her it was unrealistic, Richard continued, that we need to downsize to something practical, something we can actually afford. She didn't take it well. He rubbed his temples. I think she's been planning this for a while, Mom. Even before we knew about the mortgage, the pieces suddenly clicked into place. Diane's expensive shopping trips despite their financial troubles, her immediate push to sell the house, her interest in my escrow account money. She hadn't just been careless with money. She'd been actively planning a life upgrade at everyone else's expense. What are you going to do? I asked. Richard looked at me directly, a new resolve in his eyes. I'm going to see a financial advisor today. And I've made an appointment with a marriage counselor. You have? I couldn't hide my surprise. He nodded grimly. I love Diane, but I can't keep living like this. Something has to change. I squeezed his hand, proud of this newfound determination. That's a good first step, Richard. As I watched my son walk out the door an hour later, heading to his appointment, with the financial advisor, I felt a curious mix of emotions. Hope that he was finally taking control of his life, worry about what that might mean for his marriage, and a bittersweet pride that he was finding his voice at last. I had 5 more days in this house before moving to Riverside Gardens. 5 more days of navigating the increasingly tense atmosphere between Richard and Diane. 5 more days of packing up the remnants of my old life. But for the first time, I wasn't just counting down the days until escape. I was looking forward to what came next. For me, for Richard, and for the new relationship we might build. One based on honesty instead of obligation. Sunlight streamed through the windows of my new apartment at Riverside Gardens, illuminating freshly painted walls. The space was modest but mine, entirely mine. What do you think? Wilson asked, setting down the last box. Everything you hoped. 4? I surveyed the room where my cherished possessions, my reading chair, Harold's bookshelf, my mother's quilt, had found their place after years in storage. It's perfect, I said, meaning it. The past 2 weeks had been transformative. After discovering Richard and Diane's plans to sell the house, I had accelerated my departure. The revelation had been painful but clarifying. The property I'd sacrificed everything for was just a commodity to them. Richard had been apologetic, Diane defensive. In the end, I made my decisions. No help with the mortgage, moving out early, and focusing on my future rather than mourning the past. The community center is hosting a welcome dinner tonight, Lisa had mentioned earlier. I was both excited and nervous. It had been so long since I'd made new friends. At Richard and Diane's, I'd gradually lost touch with my social circle as Diane subtly discouraged visitors. At 6 o'clock, Wilson arrived to escort me. I dressed carefully in a blue dress I hadn't worn in years and Harold's pearl earrings. The community center buzzed with conversation. Lisa seated me between Frank, a retired English teacher, and Eleanor, who had run the local library for 30 years. First day? Frank asked kindly. I remember mine. Terrifying and exciting all at once. Exactly, I admitted. I'm not sure I remember how to make new friends. It's like riding a bicycle, Eleanor assured me. Besides, we're all in the same boat. Most of us came from living with family who meant well, but... She made a face that conveyed volumes. I laughed. You have no idea. Try me, Eleanor challenged. My daughter-in-law rearranged my entire kitchen while I was at a doctor's appointment because it's more efficient this way. Frank nodded. My son decided I couldn't be trusted with my medications after I missed one dose. Started doling them out like I was a child. My daughter-in-law called me that old witch who lives here for free and still thinks she deserves respect, I offered. While I was secretly paying their mortgage, Eleanor burst out laughing. You win. By dessert, I'd joined the book club, signed up for a garden plot, and agreed to help organize a poetry series. These people weren't just being polite, they were genuinely interested in my opinions and experiences. Later that evening, my new phone rang. "Mom?" Richard sounded hesitant. "I got your number from Wilson. How's the new place?" "Wonderful," I said honestly. "Small, but perfect. I'm glad." A pause. "Diane's sister moved in today." "I imagine that's quite an adjustment for Diane," I remarked. "You could say that," Richard replied wryly. "Anyway, I was wondering, maybe I could visit this weekend, just me?" I felt warmth spread through my chest. I'd like that very much. After we hung up, my doorbell rang. Eleanor stood there with a potted peace lily. "Housewarming gift," she announced. "Nearly impossible to kill." "Thank you," I said, touched. "Would you like tea?" "I thought you'd never ask," she replied, producing homemade cookies from her purse. We sat at my table. Eleanor looked around approvingly. "You've made it yours already. Some people take months to really move in." I nodded. "I've spent too long living in someone else's space." "To new beginnings," she said, raising her teacup. "To new beginnings," I echoed. Later, preparing for bed, I thought about my journey, the pain of Diane's words, the mortgage revelation, the difficult conversations with Richard, all necessary steps to this moment. I wondered what Harold would think. Wilson's words returned to me. Harold would be proud. He always worried about you putting everyone else first. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt profound peace. For perhaps the first time ever, I had put myself first, not selfishly, but as an act of self-respect. My new home wasn't just a physical space. It was a state of mind, a place where I could exist as Martha Wells, not as Richard's mother or Diane's unwanted mother-in-law, but as myself. Tomorrow, I would wake in my own bed, make coffee in my own kitchen, and read in my own chair. I would meet Eleanor for lunch, attend book club, and plan my garden. The house I had sacrificed for had never truly been my home. My real home, both the space and the life I was creating, had been waiting for me all along. All I had to do was claim it.